Welcome to Monologues by Hassie, where I'm going to be dropping unsolicited brain dumps from the depths of my grey matter. I'll talk about life, money, society, and self-development, plus whatever else lies up there, whilst hopefully not getting cancelled in the process. When we look at the founders of large conglomerates in the last 30 to 40 years, if we look at people like Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg, whilst they have created incredible wealth, they by no means came from humble beginnings. And this is something that we see that is very prevalent. And I think no matter where you live in the world, as humans, we kind of look down and up the social hierarchy. No matter where you are in the world, you could be in India listening to this right now. And if you think about somebody who comes from, who has a slightly better, hand of cards than you have, they will generally take on more risk, which will have more return. And this kind of eventuates in a magnification of the risk that person is able to take. And when you look over a lifetime, the outcomes are very disproportionate, right? So taking risk and being able to take risks allows you to reach a level of success that you can't reach if you had not taken that risk. It's as simple as that. If we play the safe path, then we will get the very safe results, which, depending on how you look at it, might not be very satisfying to you. And it's very natural for us to look at people who've been given a better hand of cards and say, well, they got there because they did that. And that's not what I want to talk about, because envy, of course, is a very natural human emotion. I experience it myself as well, but it's a very unproductive emotion. So I need to remind myself that no, this is not productive. But in this episode, what I want to discuss is how the size of the risks that you can take will be proportional to the size of your parachute. So when I look at kind of Sydney society and the people that I've been exposed to, whilst arguably living in, one of the great cities in the world and a great country to live in, right? Let alone city, is the careers that private school children will have in their 30s are the same careers that public school children will have in their 40s. And a lot of the reasons that I see this when I look around is, well, the exposure to different opportunities is so much different when you're coming from a, wealthier background. Generally, you will have parents who are more entrepreneurial or are more established in their professions. And this really flows down to the children who will be able to take greater risk than the parents. And you see this magnification of success. And public school kids eventually get there by their 40s. But it's one of these things where it takes longer, and I think that's natural. So this isn't about being resentful. That's not the message I'm putting out there. In fact, I think that's a horrible thing to do. But one thing you need to appreciate is not that somebody else has a better deck of cards, because whilst me and you are having this conversation, which is unfortunately a one-way conversation, there are people who are looking at us and thinking, wow, these people have it so much better than I do. So anything you feel towards somebody else who you perceive as above you, there is somebody who you are more privileged than who is looking at you with exactly the same emotion. And that's why I say envy is a very useless emotion. We should cast it aside. That's not what we're doing. If you're trying to level up and do something great and manifest some of your ambitions and aspirations, then one thing it's useful to do is actually identify that concept. When you look at those, if I take in Sydney society, the private school children who may come from very wealthy families and are able to take a bit more risk and are a bit more carefree at work, and as a result they can get better outcomes, look at that and think about how you can implement some of that in your own life. And today, I really want to talk about how we can build our own parachutes. Because if we can find a way to increase our parachutes in such a way that we can take on more risk, because we've created our own sense of safety, right? If you can create psychological safety for yourself to take on more risk, you can reap those benefits. And yes, it will be on a different time scale to somebody who was born into the right family or the right class structure. That's not what we're here to discuss. But when I think about the types of parachutes that are available to us, it probably falls into three broad categories. I think the first one is financial, and that's probably the most evident one. If you have money, that gives you access to power and connections and so many other things. So I think money is a big one, and we can put that to one side. We'll come back to that. And then the other two is knowledge and skills. And that's a very important one, because if you increase your knowledge and skills, you will have the confidence to attempt more things. You might have the knowledge to mitigate some of the risks, or sorry, not some of the risks, some of the pitfalls of taking the risks that you want to take. And I think the third one, which is probably not very spoken about, is having emotional capital. And that is having the tools, the skill set, and the mindset to be able to safely take risk and not end up in some really horrible mental black hole. And the beautiful thing is, even if you don't start off with the financial capital, I think you can really build up the knowledge and the emotional capital to be able to de-risk your life so you can take on more calculated risks. And these are the positive things we can do. And then when I look at the middle class, I find there's a lot of traps that the middle class gets into, which actually makes it harder to take risks. So one thing I've always said, and somebody I used to date worked for what we call is the Big Four. And if you're not from the Western world, you might not have heard of the Big Four, but actually, now that I think of it, the Big Four accounting firms, so this is PwC, EY, KPMG, and there's another one, Deloitte. Right, so these Big Four accounting firms or audit firms, I've always looked at them, and I used to date somebody who worked at one of these firms, and their salaries were so low. And the way I saw it is there are actually really good opportunities. Now, it is a very pyramid structure. So what generally happens is they bring people in who have, young accountants and actuaries and different professions that go into these firms. They don't pay them particularly great relative to the market. But if you stay for long enough, you either exit and you get a great opportunity. But the people who actually go up to the top in these businesses and become the kind of partners and the owners of these partnerships, or the co-owners of these partnerships, they're generally the people who stuck with it. And here's the thing, to stick with it at a low income, I've always said that these types of jobs are really good for people who come from families where there is already money, because they can navigate these environments without a care of cost. They don't have to worry about their next rent payment or their next mortgage payment or the fact that inflation's going up. They can subsist on that $55,000 or $60,000 salary. Why? Because they're not too concerned about money. They know that somebody's out there to help them with a down payment, and maybe there's an inheritance coming. And this gives these people a level of psychological security to be able to rise through the ranks and to take risks that their peers can't do. And the peers are the ones who, eventually get their creds and realize that, hey, I've kind of got to leave out because I've done 2 to 3 years here, but my life is going nowhere. I'm barely getting paid, and they need to exit these Big Four industries, these Big Four accounting firms. So I guess creating that parachute, if you haven't got the parachute, then you need to create it. So knowledge is important, emotional capital is important, and that's really fortitude in building that up. But let's go back to financial. And I think when it comes to building financial capital, I think you can do small things which make it easier for you to take on more risk. So the biggest, again, back to this, and I kind of got sidetracked. The biggest trap that I see a lot of middle class people doing, and the reason I say this is because when I'm very middle class, and when I maybe upper middle class, depending on how you look at it, as I said, everything's relative. Different people will look at me differently, and that's fine. When I look at people who generally come from the socioeconomic status I do, and now that I'm kind of coming to the end of my 20s and approaching my 30s, everyone's getting these mortgages. And when I look at people who have, not just getting mortgages by themselves, when they're married, and when I look at what's the biggest thing that they will typically do in their 20s to early 30s? They will take out a mortgage. And in a city like Sydney, where the cost of housing is so high, these people will generally leverage themselves up to their eyeballs because there's a level of status that they need to achieve. And generally they're either buying a kind of a new development far out that is $1 million plus, or they're buying something very fancy. And as a result of that, they have so much debt that what they've actually done is they've become, the perfect employee. They've got such a high mortgage, they need their current income, and they are unable to drop their day-to-day income so they can do something risky. Right? Just like when I was talking about, the kids who come from really well-off families earning their very low Big Four wages, they can take the risks. But now if you in the middle class have gone and made this financial commitment where you have chained yourself right, to the big four banks. And that's an Australian term. But if you've taken out such a large mortgage where you now are essentially an employee of our economic system, where you are afraid to take on more risks because you need your job to pay your mortgage, where you've taken on that much debt, where you can not lower your income in the foreseeable future, you're now chained to the system. You've now created something where you are unable to take the risk that you complain about that people who come from more privileged backgrounds take. And again, this isn't that life is not about being fair, but I'm saying that there are ways to create these financial advantages. And it's something as small as being, do we really need to live in the biggest house as possible? For the early part of our life, can we get away with a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment instead of a full house? And building that's one way of, I think, avoiding a financial pitfall, because if you take on too much debt, and not just residential debt, if you take on too much consumer debt, personal loans and this sort of things, and car loans, really what this does is it makes you very risk averse, because you are going to be avoiding risk, because you know that, hey, I can't lose my job. I need to kind of toe the line here. And that's a very dangerous thing. I think the second thing you can do, outside of avoiding things like having too much residential or consumer debt, and the reason I flag those two types of debt out is because they are the types of debt which generally will not earn you any money. Of course, there's exceptions to every rule, but if you can avoid that or minimize that, and try to live within your means as much as possible. The next thing you can do financially is, create a financial buffer. So one of the things I've done over the last 3 years is I've just been regularly investing, and I've got to the point where, I've got by no means a lot of money, a huge sum of money, but I've got something where I can look at it and I can feel rather comfortable, and I can say, great, well, I've built up this amount of money. Hypothetically, worst case scenario, if I wanted to take a year or 2 off work and focus on something and say, you know what, I'm going to sell down my shares and just, use this to do something, I can do it. And that is a weird type of freedom. And, it's all relative, because naturally I'm trying to become even more free, which means that I'm going to keep working. But if I wanted to take that big leap of faith, it's possible. And same thing goes for having an emergency fund. So there are very small things we can do financially to increase the size of our parachute and, avoid decreasing our parachute. And the ways we decrease our parachute is by taking on a lot of consumer and residential mortgage debt, which is non-productive. So you're chaining yourself to the system, so you avoid that. And then to increase the size of your financial parachute, you want to have your savings, your investments, basically something that you can look at and say, well, if something were to happen, and in my case as well, I also took out a number of insurance products to, again, give me a bit more peace of mind, knowing that I don't need to inherently go paycheck to paycheck to survive, and that if I did want to walk away from my job today, that I could actually go ahead and make that decision. That is a great sense of security for me. The next thing that I want to get into, number 2, is knowledge and skills. So having financial capital is one thing, and maybe you're in a position where it is very difficult for you to accrue financial capital. That is fairly reasonable. The next thing you can do is look at your knowledge capital and your skills capital. And these are really part and parcel. So what can you be doing to increase the value of the products and services you produce in this economy? And this can have many flow-on effects. It could increase your income in your normal job, right? If you're producing more, you should be able to ask for more. And hopefully, if you have reasonable people who employ you, they will see that, well, you're bringing more value than you were, and we're going to give you a cut of those profits. Great. So that's one way. But then if you do want to venture out on your own, and it doesn't even need to be starting a business, but if you want to venture into a new career path, and that's, again, something that if you look at your stereotypical rich kids, they can easily jump around and go back to uni and do this. They've got the buffers to go and learn those skills. It won't be the same journey for you. But if you do want to increase your parachute, then investing in knowledge and skills is going to be a big way that you can do this. In my case, I know that there are going to be problems that I want to solve in the future. And right now, I want to learn skills which are going to help me solve those problems. I don't even know what some of those problems are. In the short to medium term, there are plenty of problems that I would like to solve. And I'm learning the skills for these. But I also realize there are some nuances where I need to invest in skills where I don't see an immediate short to medium term use, but might have long-term value. And of course, that's a gamble, but I don't even think that's a gamble, because no matter what, that returns dividends to me in so many ways by taking the time to learn a skill and learn something new and learn an area of knowledge outside of what I normally do. I always win from that. So I view that as a win situation no matter what, because I get to be mentally stimulated, engaged. It often gives me a bit of energy back, and it's a valuable thing. It's a valuable way that I personally use to increase the size of my parachute. If I look at what I've done this year, I think two of the big things I did was I went to sales training. So I'm somebody who's a software engineer, and I went to sales training. And the reason I went to sales training is, well, one, I wanted to learn how to sell better, because I think it's really important that no matter what walk of life we're in, it doesn't matter whether you are a small farmer, you're a doctor, you're a dentist, you're a lawyer, you're a software engineer, you're a train conductor, it doesn't matter what your job is or who you are going to have to sell yourself at some point. It doesn't matter whether that's in the context of finding a life partner or finding a job, or you might decide to run for your local council. You're going to have to learn how to sell yourself. So it's a valuable skill. But B, I got to be exposed to people who were in sales. And it was very interesting to step out of the people who I normally interact with, who are normally more technical, and to be engaging with people who were, part of big businesses, like, those meal delivery services, and they were working out how to sell their product and services to markets that they had not traditionally tapped into. And I found that very valuable. And then I also went to something called, the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and I did their not-for-profit governance training. And again, a very similar experience. I wanted to understand, how does an organization effectively implement good governance? And I thought that doing this 2.5-day course would be valuable for me. And it indeed was, because I learned a lot about how to, at a very high level, how a board runs in a company or a not-for-profit. And I got to meet some incredible people who were on boards and running companies and running charities and not-for-profits. And it was a very enlightening experience. So I've been expanding my parachute of knowledge, which means that if I need to go and take a risk, in that domain area, I'm a little bit less scared. And I want that to lead to the very last point that I want to get into and really drill down. It's having this emotional capital to deal with the challenges that you're going to face when you decide to take on more risks. And you might not decide to take on a huge risk today. You might not decide to take on a huge risk tomorrow. But when you eventually do, you want to be prepared. And this is where mental fortitude comes in. And to achieve this one, I think this is the hardest thing. I can't say that I'm perfect at this, because everyone will suffer from their ups and downs, but I have personally become better. And if I reflect on how I deal with challenges and stress, I'm grateful for the development that I've done and the people who I've met along my journey who've helped me out there, like with that process. And one of those is, for example, going and seeing a therapist when I was depressed. And again, I'm going to say that maybe you're in a part of the world where these services aren't accessible. There may be a version of this that you can access. There may be something online that you can access to help you with this. And that's one part of it. The other part is, I also did a 10-day silent meditation retreat called Vipassana, which really challenged, my mental and cognitive abilities. So that was very important, building that that mental fortitude, because I think 10 days in silence absolutely had so many negative thoughts and feelings really rise to the surface, and I had to tackle them. I went to war with my mind. And then doing other things like journaling and reading books and reading philosophy, these have all been things which have helped build my mental fortitude, which I know is going to be very valuable. Even now, I find myself taking, even in a small way, more risks professionally and outside of work, but which is also professional. It's just not my main job. I find myself just taking more risks than I have before. I'm more confident to put things out there. I'm less concerned about whether people are going to have a positive or negative reaction. I'm simply more comfortable with, I think, building things in public and saying that, hey, this is something I've done, and putting that out there. And maybe it's going to get crickets, but that's fine. It's part of building that mental fortitude that I think is going to be, not that I think, I know is going to be valuable for when I do move on to tackle bigger problems than I currently tackle right now. So to summarize this episode, a lot of us look at the people around us and we will pick people who come from well-class families, higher class families than from where we are, who have generally had a better hand of cards given to them when they were born, and we will say, well, these people can go and achieve those things because they started off with that. And what I'm telling you today is, first, put the envy away. It's not helpful. And the second one is, what you should actually do when you look at these people is say, cool, they got there and they took these risks because they had these particular parachutes in their life, which made them feel safe enough to take on this level of risk. What can I do in my life so I can also take on that risk? And that's a very important discussion to have with yourself, because that by having that discussion today, the version of you 10 years in the future who's doing something incredible is going to thank you for having that discussion, for figuring out how you can increase your risk tolerance. And this is going to look different to everyone listening to this. If you are in the Philippines or if you are in India, what you are going to do and to increase, the steps that you are going to take to increase your risk tolerance, to increase the size of your parachute, is going to be different than what somebody in Australia or somebody in London or somebody in America does. And that's fine, because it's not about anybody else, right? It's not a competition. It's not about, there's no envy. There's no looking up. It's just, where are you right now? What is the size of your parachutes right now? What are the size of your financial, your knowledge, and your emotional parachutes at this moment? And what can you do to increase these 3 parachutes so you can take on more risk and do something great? And it doesn't matter what you want to do, but what can you do to take on more risk? And that's really, I hate to give homework, but if you've gone through this episode and you've listened to it, that's your homework. Figure out how you can improve and increase the size of your parachutes, right? Figure out what you can do to avoid harming those parachutes, like taking consumer debt and taking too much residential mortgage debt. And figure this out, and it'll do you wonders. So I'll leave it there. And to all of you listening to this, I wish you great success on all your endeavors. You've just made it through another episode of Monologues by Hassie. It brings me great pleasure to know that you made it to the end. To listen to more episodes, subscribe on your favorite podcast app or visit monologuesbyhassie.com. Thanks for swinging by.